Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's webinar. We're very excited to talk about scenario planning and exploring the unknown with Stanford D.School's Lisa K. Solomon, and she'll be in conversation with our intrepid leader of the Aspen Institute, Mr. Dan P. Porterfield. With further ado, please welcome Dan and Lisa.
Thank you, Cordell. Thank you all for being here. We're so pleased with all the ways that the Socrates program is stepping up to respond to the demands of the moment. The Aspen Institute is really all about driving change towards a free, just, and equitable society. We do that in lots of ways, through inclusive dialogue, through leadership development that emphasizes values and making impact, through efforts to create solutions to very pressing problems. Do it in a spirit of bringing people together and finding common ground. We were built for these times. We've also had to pivot, and we're doing a lot of scenario planning right now in the spirit of Lisa K. Solomon as we try to make sure that the Aspen Institute isn't only coping with the crisis, which we are, but also is creating new value and solutions for our country and our society. And I think that's the spirit of your work, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us. You're all about creating and designing solutions for problems that affect humans. Thank you so much for being here. And how are you doing working from a form of quarantine?
Well, Dan, thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this webinar series that, as you said, really is more important than ever. I mean, how we support leaders in moments of increasing uncertainty. As you said, you've been preparing for this for a long time, and I do think it's an extraordinary leadership opportunity, so I'm thrilled to be talking about this with you. I'm calling in from about a mile from Stanford, where I live, and we were early to quarantine. So this has become a bit of our new normal, and I've been humbled and just so appreciative of everything my colleagues and I have been doing to try to bring human-centeredness to this new world that we're all living in.
And that's part of the topic for today's conversation. And we'll spend about a half an hour in dialogue and then open it up for questions that Cordell will moderate. And thank you again so much for making time for us. So let's start just with this one, just to ground the audience a bit. How would you describe futures thinking as a discipline? And can you share some examples of where you've seen it done effectively?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan, and it's definitely work I've been focused on for almost 20 years, if you believe it. Helping leaders think more generatively, more expansively about the future, knowing that we can't predict the future, but we can do things to make us more prepared, to allow us to shape the future that we want to see come to life. So I know futures can be kind of abstract to people, and part of my job is to make things concrete. So if you'll allow me, I actually prepared a few slides to really ground us in some of these foundational principles, and hopefully the audience will see themselves, and this will trigger some questions for them. So I'll ask for forgiveness in case this screen share goes awry, but that's where we are these days.
Yeah.
So
looking good.
So far. So,
Yeah.
So the topic of this is exploring future scenarios, but I really see this as an opportunity to upframe that a little bit, to say, how can we all be more future focused? And as you rightly said, my work focuses on this combination of the discipline of futures thinking and design thinking. And put simply, that means futures asks us to say, how might the world change and why? So not can we predict the future, but how can we be more curious? How can we develop anticipatory skills to understand where the future is going? And design asks us, how might we create value for people in those futures? So I think together, this is really the essence of the leadership opportunity of this moment, is to learn how to understand where the future is going, knowing we can't control it all, and to make sure we're grounding our choices in serving others and creating value for them. And Dan, to me, the best part about this is that I do believe these are teachable and learnable skills. I don't believe they're magic or talent innate to only certain people. And so, as you said, I get to do this work at the D.School. And for those of you that haven't visited, this is a picture of our atrium, a big bias towards action, towards experiential learning, project-based learning, where we get to build our capacity to think and operate this way on a daily basis, not just when it's called in crisis. I focus specifically on asking questions like this. What do we think is inevitable? How do we plan for the things that are predetermined? How do we cultivate empathy for the future? Who shapes the future? And our hope is that the future leaders that we touch there come out with a greater sense of agency, feeling creative confidence in their work. So just really simply, futures thinking is not about predicting the future. So just a warning to everyone listening, if someone tells you that they know what's happening, you should have your questions ready for them, because we can't predict the future, but that doesn't mean the future has to happen to us, that we can learn using our imagination to explore a wider range of futures and to be critical thinkers in that process. For me, it boils down to 3 broad skills. One is learning to see the future, meaning to use our imagination and to build anticipatory skills by seeing what's out there and asking what if and what could happen next. Lots of ways to do that. But one way is to say, what do I see happening now? And how do I then tease out second and third order consequences of that? Asking headlines of the future is another quick way to get us out of what we see today and allow us to explore something totally new, just to trigger different questions. The second broad category is, once we've seen a wide range of futures, how do we as leaders shape the future? How do we figure out where to invest our time and resources in order to bring about our preferred future, or at the very least, to mitigate the future that we don't want to see happen? And this is a combination of systems thinking and ethical thinking and critical thinking to look at where is the best investment in order to bring about the future that will really serve all of us. This is about looking at driving forces of change and investing in some core system dynamics, looking at the high uncertainty and high impact ones. I just showed a quick example. You asked, where's it gone well? This is one of my absolute favorites that I'm watching pretty closely. This is an incredible example of a partnership between Sesame Street and the International Rescue Committee that have joined forces in order to create virtual education for millions of refugee children in the Middle East. So a great futures mindset to say, these children have been displaced, but thinking like a futurist, they're not going to stay children forever. So how do we make sure that they're living a life that they are prepared to be productive? This is just another example of a project that I've been working on called Vote by Design, where we, in essence, rehearse potential futures that our future leader might have to react to, and how that informs our voting decision to, again, help future voters shape the future. And then the last part I'll share on this, seeing the future, shaping the future, is the ability to share the future, to get others on board. So the ability to communicate in ways that others can get and to bridge community. And I think that's so much of the work I know Aspen Institute is doing in lots of ways, is to connect others so that they see themselves as part of this shared future. And just a couple quick examples that I really admire so much. One is a wonderful program called Vision Not Victim, started by Meredith Hutchinson, that again goes to refugee camps to help these children take pictures of themselves as their future selves, to have this beautiful artifact to share a future that changes the trajectory of their life because they've gotten their families and their communities on board to support them being a doctor or support them being a teacher. And another is just another example from a class I teach at Stanford called Inventing the Future, where we have our students create debates of the future to bring them to life. So 50-year utopian and dystopian, in order to essentially rehearse these emerging technologies to make sure we're asking the question, should we build this, not can we build this? So just a little snapshot of futures thinking in my mind is about learning how to see the future, learning how to shape the future, and share the future. And this is really a lifelong practice.
Can you give us an example of something that you've seen come together, whether it was intentionally created or tacitly it unfolded along this way, where, you know, like a group was able to see something and was then able to shape it and then was able to share it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And honestly, Dan, we're seeing that unfold almost every day. I mean, the innovation and the creativity that's happening in this moment is extraordinary. And I'll just share a great example from my colleagues at the D.School that run something called the K-12 lab, where they're specifically focused on K-12 education. So they very, very quickly saw a future where we were not going to be able to teach in the same way. Everyone was quarantined at home, shelter in place. And here we have these kind of overnight educators, meaning the parents and the caretakers that, are not quite prepared. So they've been quickly mobilizing to create live design sprints and hackathons to help support this group that finds themselves in an unexpected situation of having to now be an educator as well as caretaker for their children, to come up with new ideas of how to engage them and how to plug into what's already there. So literally using, I was talking to Cordell earlier, things like TikTok as a way of understanding the student experience, because now we can't see students directly. So how do we get a sense of what their experience has been in order to make choices that support them? So they're preparing for not just a short session where we're going to return to normal, but really trying to look at what does education and what does learning mean in this new distributed way.
Yeah, I can imagine if we were, you really had the time to really work through one of your classes, a lot of time gets spent on shape the future, because there's so much involved in creating the path, the critical path forward, and then executing on that path and, adapting in real life as, things unfold differently than the path you might have hoped it would unfold. The agility of mind that's needed for future thinking seems pretty important to me. Am I right about that?
I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I'm struck with this moment where we have to be more agile, more comfortable with ambiguity than we've ever been before. Yeah. And I have great empathy for leaders and teachers right now that frankly have not had the practice to be the masters that they're asked to be at this moment.
Yeah.
And one of my great passions is to make futures thinking mandatory, or at least offer it to all. Because if we think about the skills that are non-negotiable, whatever the return path is to wherever place we land, we know that the world we live in is going to be filled with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of dynamic forces. And so to think that most of our time is practicing known answers and getting to things quickly and with certainty, there's just a mismatch there. So I think it's an enormous opportunity for leaders of all ages, starting with K-12, to start to be more intentional about imagination, having to hold two tensions at the same time, to develop a hypothesis, to go gather evidence without the complete data and make a choice anyway.
Yeah.
And that's what we're having to do all day long.
Yeah. And of course, when our assumptions are disrupted dramatically, we often cling to what we know. And part of your point is cling to what you know may not be the best way forward if you want to create a different future.
I couldn't agree more, Dan. And I would just add to that, we often don't know we're clinging to what we know.
Yeah.
We all walk around with, in futures language, it's called an official future. The future we think is going to happen. Often it's some version of today, and I would say pre-COVID, it was today plus 10%. I mean, look at any strategic plan, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a spreadsheet with some sensitivity analysis, which gives us this false sense that we'll be able to deliver on the future. And I always say the future doesn't care what your plan says, right? The future is going to tee up different kinds of uncertainty. And we're just facing that more acutely now than ever.
So something that you've spoken to me a little bit about is scenario planning. And
Yes.
Say a word about what that is for our audience. And then maybe I'll pivot to the current moment with COVID-19.
Yes. Yeah, great. So futures can come in lots of different flavors. Many of us have been exposed to futures, just by reading Frankenstein, right? Science fiction is a great form of futures, or The Handmaid's Tale, right, which is more of a speculative futures. Scenario planning is a strategic process that really couples more traditional strategic planning processes that does three core things. It takes a long view. So whereas oftentimes strategic plans kind of end at your 3-year plan, for whatever reason, someone decided that was the right year, this tends to take a longer view. And when I started doing scenario planning almost 20 years ago, a long view was 10 years out. Now 18 months feels like a long view. But the point is that you're taking a long enough view out that you're stretching yourself beyond what you can see right in front of you. The second thing that scenario planning does, which is so critical, is that it looks at trends from the outside in, meaning it takes a look at what's happening around us in social changes, technology changes, environmental changes, economic changes, and political changes, and asks, what are the driving forces? How might they affect our industry? And ultimately, how might they affect our industry? So hopefully some of the listeners will see, well, that's a very different approach than the SWOT analysis, for example, that we're often taught to do, which starts with our strengths. So this takes this outside view and says we need to monitor trends differently and make sure we're not getting surprised. And then the third critical element of scenario planning, which gets back to the learning mindset that you were talking about earlier, is that it asks that we bring in lots of different perspectives to make sure that we are not getting blindsided by something adjacent to us or even further off. So it's really a process that allows us to develop rich alternative futures that are plausible. So when done well, it is based on data. It's not just stories, but they are formed as narratives so that we can start to test our assumptions against them.
Yeah. We know one thing I've seen in organizations when they embark upon strategic planning is that for many, it's a kind of a performative
Yes.
gesture they know they need to do it, but they don't do it like they want to do it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like
Oh, yeah.
they need an outcome that would be acceptable. And that builds in a limiting factor at the very start.
Well, if you think about it, it's sort of an extension of how a lot of K-12 education is done, right? Get to the answer and be done, versus can you embrace a learning mindset?
Yeah.
Can you ask questions that you don't know the answer to? How might you embrace a discovery mindset of what's on the other side of what you can see? And, we know many leaders, Dan, they're really uncomfortable with that. And to be fair, we're now learning from neuroscience, our brains are not wired to enjoy uncertainty.
Yeah.
We like knowing if we're going to get eaten or not by that lion. So we're looking to hunker down. So I always find it interesting. And again, I have great empathy for at the precise moment that leaders need to be expansive in their thinking, they're shutting down because they're feeling such anxiety.
Yeah, that's interesting. You could say there's the discovery mindset and the deliverable mindset.
Yes.
And we often rush to the deliverable and shortcut the discovery. And we really need both.
That's right. And you can back that up into say, well, what are the behaviors that support the discovery mindset, for example? And I have yet to see a standardized test that honors the number of questions that a student asks.
Yeah.
Right? It's all about what they answer. So you could see that built into our systems are these reinforcing loops of that performative mindset.
You're speaking my language, but we have 180 people that are here, so I can't just run down that corridor to talk more. But I really think education should be about creating that discoverer's mindset. That's the purpose of education, I think.
Yes.
So let's though apply the thinking, futures thinking, scenario planning, however you'd like to do it, to the present moment.
Yes.
And just give our participants here a way to interpret the circumstances we're in right now and where we might be later.
Great. So I took the liberty of sort of like those cooking shows where they've diced the onions ahead of time and the turkey's been in the oven. So I did a little bit of that slicing and dicing so we could, again, ground it for the folks that are listening. So I'm going to share my screen again here and pull up these quick scenarios that we talked about. So if we think about exploring a range of new futures, right? So right now, we are getting a plethora of information and questions that are focused on when are we going to go back to normal, right? That certainty question. Is it summer? Is it fall? When? Give me a time frame. So in some ways, futures has never been more active in the dialogue. I, again, think this is an enormous opportunity to say, let's not just focus on the answer. Let's focus on the process that all of us can build those anticipatory skills. As I mentioned, if we apply these 3 core principles of scenario planning, the long view, outside in, and multiple perspectives, and we could take a look at what I've done is I've distilled a lot of these models that are out there. I mean, the good news is that scenarios are abundant right now. If anyone wants to just type in Google COVID and scenarios, whammo, this is just a little snapshot of what you're going to see. And I want to suggest that the creating of the scenarios is actually that's the easy part. It's the conversation about the scenarios and how ready you are. That's the part that I think people really need to focus on. So what I've done here is I've distilled it down to 2 of these external driving forces that I think are on a lot of people's mind. So one is the duration and intensity of the pandemic. And what we're going to do here is we're going to lean into that ambiguity, knowing that none of us really have the answer to that. So on the one hand, for example, we could see that the pandemic is shorter and milder than some of the, very difficult predictions that we're hearing. Testing becomes abundant. We get promising antiviral treatments. Vaccine is fast-tracked. Healthcare system receives the support that they need. These are things we can start to monitor to suggest that we might be heading in a shorter or milder direction. Herd immunity, and we're watching different communities and their approaches. And we can equally see the possibility that it might be longer, that we actually have higher death levels than we had predicted, that the healthcare systems, particularly in the rural areas, continue to get strapped. We have uneven and unreliable access to testing, the slow evolution of treatment. So we could see it going either way. So that's one critical driving force that many of us are paying attention to. And if we juxtapose that with the other that a lot are paying attention, which is what is the depth and length of the economic impacts? And again, we could see on the one hand, deep and lasting impacts, right? Widespread employment loss continues, devastation of specific sectors, retail gutted, schools stay shut, mounting pressure on food banks. I mean, these are not easy things to read and to lean into, but they are possible. And that's part of what this process allows us to do. At the same time, we could see a scenario where actually things open up and things are okay, and the government stimulus really helps, and industries bounce back, and we get the benefit of some of the larger organizations that are now really taking some responsibility for propping up other industries, right? The gig economy comes back. So if we put these two driving forces together and we juxtapose their axes, we start to see four very different scenarios come up. And again, we're not predicting the future. We're just allowing us some data in order to explore it more productively. So we could see a growth or return to normal-ish is what I'm calling, because we know it's, whatever it is, it's gonna feel different. We can see in the upper left, if it's a shorter duration, but a slower economic recovery, a more constrained scenario. On the bottom left, of course, a scenario that nobody wants, which is a collapse scenario. And on the right, bottom right, we could see, what we might call a transformation scenario. This is probably a little bit unlikely, but not crazy if we think of perhaps some things get fast-tracked and we're able to return. And just to give you a visual of that, because sometimes that helps to give that kind of narrative feel. Already, for example, at Stanford, they're talking about research labs coming back in fall. They're not exactly sure about the semester. We can imagine restaurants opening up in a very different way on that constrained scenario. Collapse, we're already seeing horrific pictures of food banks and the pressure on social systems. And we're also seeing tremendous innovation and collaboration like we've never seen before with the drug companies and with the hackers and engineers that are coming together and just doing the most extraordinary things. So, one thing to think about is to say, well, what's robust? And anyone can do this. Like I said, these scenarios are not proprietary. They're available for you. The question is for you to ask, what's robust? What should you start doing? What should you maybe experiment with? What should you stop doing? What new questions should you consider? And, maybe what new conversations you want to have? What do you want to monitor more closely? So it becomes a process that's filled with agency and productive learning as opposed to paralysis.
So that sort of is this kind of like see the future right there. Then there's shape the future. And then there's share the future. So on the shape the future, I don't know, we probably have a lot of listeners here that would love to shape a better future than the one that their own internal scenario planning tells them is at least plausible, if not predictable.
Yes.
So how do we unleash people then to be shapers?
Yes. I mean, I love that question. That is my driving question. Yeah. How do we embrace agency? How do we make sure that the future is not happening to us? Again, Dan, I have been so blown away by what I'm seeing of all ages, including some of the incredible work coming out of the Aspen Institute. I mean, I think the effort, for example, around weaving communities, around helping communities feel like they are not alone. That will matter across all four of those futures, right? No matter where we land, no matter how fast we get back to being outside and seeing people, we have some we have some grief to get over. We have some loneliness. We have some trauma that we have experienced. How do we support one another? And so, I think of that Weave effort as an extraordinary future-focused effort to say, we're going to be stronger together. And I know that there's a lot of effort that you're doing around strengthening our civic engagement. And what does that mean? And making sure that our systematic economic and income gaps are not widening, but we're now using what has been a spotlight on them. As I just heard Cory Booker this weekend say, I don't want to return to normal. I want to return to better.
Yeah.
So like, how do we use now this new knowledge that we've now seen, to your point, to shape a better future?
So on something this complex, and this is as complex as any of us have lived through, this is a time when the shaping of the future really needs a number of different complementary efforts. One might be breaking down hyperpartisanship. One might be building up local solutions and local community. One might be investing in testing capacity at a much higher level. Another might be contact tracing. Some of these are related directly to one another. Others are almost allies, anonymous allies to each other, and anonymously complementary, or serendipitously aligned. At the social level, at the big level. How do you respond when someone has a great idea to make an impact to shape the future, but it's only one part, it's only one option among many?
Yeah, it's a great question and a hard question, Dan. One of the things that you can do is to say, look, if this is our preferred future, and you go out in advance, and then you start to do something called backcasting, where you say, well, what would have to be true for that future to come to life? And then you start to pick apart all those pieces, and ideally you visualize it. I'm a huge fan of visual thinking, putting it on a map, so that way you can really identify what are the key stakeholders, what needs to happen for this to happen. So you're testing your assumptions, ideally, and that's what's part of the sharing the future that I mentioned, that community connection, and that you get aligned on the purpose, the larger purpose. Different players may have different goals, but you have to align around that purpose. But it takes incredible coordination, Dan, and I think, it speaks to some more leadership skills that I don't think are talked about enough. Facilitation skills, integration skills, systems, impact skills. Again, show me the masters in that, right? We're just at the beginning, but we know we can't have impact at scale if we're not figuring out how to bring everybody on board.
Yeah.
And as someone that has spent a lot of time figuring out how to design strategic conversations across difference with different stakeholders, it's a craft in until itself. Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do. The other thing I would say, because I want to get back to your point about this being complex and complicated, one of the first things I always like to do when starting any project along this nature, where it requires a lot of people you don't quite know, you're discovering together, is to get clarity ahead of time about what is fixed and what is loose. What are the non-negotiables? What's going to determine whether you're going to go or not go, and what isn't? In design, we would call that a design criteria. And in one of the books I've written, we actually have a sort of tool for that that's so simple, that just says, what must this do? What should this do? What could this do? And what won't this do? Yeah. And so, for example, if you've identified, this won't alienate anyone, we're not doing that. Okay, well then So those kinds of framing tools can be really helpful in getting all of those different folks on board.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the way you think about this is that it does disrupt some of the traditional notions of leadership, which so strongly emphasize decisiveness above the other components that precede decisiveness, which involve facilitating inclusion, scenario planning, open-mindedness, evaluation, forecasting, and eventually you do need decisiveness, but not before you've really prepared for it.
Yeah.
One part of preparation, and this you made me think of it when you talked about the inclusive part, is that so often in our society around problem solving, those that would be a part that would benefit from the better future are not brought into the process.
Yes.
Especially the poor, the vulnerable, those that have been subjected to structural discrimination of different types. And so sometimes scenario planning is happening, or future scenario thinking is happening, but it's not an inclusive group.
Yes.
And is there a way to think about that, that we have to think about that, any of us that want to solve big problems around inclusion and around building a more participatory process?
Such a wonderful question, Dan. Yes. I mean, and this is where design can really come in, because when design is done well, it leads with empathy and really trying to understand, who are we designing for? And ideally, we can first identify that when we say we are designing for the future, that future is inclusive. And we shouldn't take it for granted that everybody thinks it is. I mean, I think that's a first step, is to identify what a preferred future looks like.
Yeah.
And the other that I would say, there's two parts. One is then to make sure that we are including those voices, that we are finding them, and that when we do find them, invite them in, we are inviting them in to listen and learn from them, not to be there because we've checked a box that says, yep, we've gotten our inclusion fill. But we have to create conditions that feel like that all voices can be heard, all voices can be included. And that in and of itself is a design skill. How do you create the space that allows people to feel like they're welcome? I'll give you an example. When we used to, way back when, Dan, when we used to meet in person, when we would have these in conversations, we would get the boardroom with the big table and we'd invite people around. And what is the most intimidating thing you can imagine for someone that's not used to being invited to those conversations? A big boardroom with a table. And so we have to think about, one of my favorite definitions of design is making choices that trigger the right responses. And we're all capable of that. When people say, I'm not a designer, I can't draw, I say, listen, do you make choices that affect other people? Yes, you're a designer. So if you can make choices that allow those people to come into the process and feel welcomed, then that is a huge, huge part of it. But it takes work. It takes work and it takes effort and intention.
Yeah. There's, at the Aspen Institute, a lot of our programs that work on framing and solving problems emphasize, we use the term co-creation. And it starts with sharing experiences for a period of time, not just one coffee hour, really sharing experiences with and being embedded in the communities that our colleagues are working in. And because I'm struck that even when we say include those whose problems we hope to help, or include those who we've left out, there's still a we and a they. And it'd be great if we, the ones that like to design solutions, would sometimes go there to join what others have already done, to be a participant as opposed to a driver of a change that others have come up with. And that doesn't happen that much, I bet. But is that possible? What I'm saying?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is. And I have some colleagues, and I think one of them actually may be on the call right now, that is going to rural areas and co-creating change with the leaders of the system. Yeah. And in doing so, Dan, when done well, then you empower the communities to lead themselves. And it's not, oh, well, we think you should do this. It's from within. And I think that's the only way you can make lasting change. I mean, my great hope and why I love teaching at the D.School in these experiential ways is that not only do you come up with ideas that you didn't even know existed before, but you're building your own capacity in the process. And that's what I'm seeing happen even right now. And again, I'll just refer to some of my colleagues. I'll give you another example. We have another program called the University Innovation Fellows, which has about 3,000 university students and faculty members that are not at Stanford, but want access to and want to learn with us. And they ran a challenge a couple weeks ago called University Innovation Fellows versus Corona. And again, they had students calling in from all over to co-create new solutions. And what we were doing is we were learning how to operate in this new reality of distributed calling in, people coming in from India. And so I think more than anything, Dan, to your point of how do we get rid of us versus them, we're all learners. We all have to show up as learners in support of driving impact. Yeah. And within that comes curiosity and humility and the ability to learn from others and the ability to learn from context. And I think, we're going to see that the leaders that do best right now are ones that are taking an open learning stance and are doing so with great empathy and compassion.
Yeah. So I think it's a good time to open it up to the group that signed on. More than 175 people. They've been with us for this first half an hour. Cordell, are you going to moderate the Q&A?
Yes, I will. Great. So first question, this is an anonymous trustee, a panelist. He says, I'm a CEO of a nonprofit, and I'm here to think about the plan for my organization's future, the one that's 3, 6, 12 months out, not 20 years, by considering multiple scenarios. And he's hoping to get some tips, techniques on how to best structure his thought process as he leads his organization through that.
Yeah. Great question. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking of a similar version for them, and I think one of it is balancing both short term. I think a lot of leaders right now are in still triage of sort of making sure that they stay viable and that they're doing so as humanely as possible, knowing that we're all having to make, really difficult choices right now. And I would encourage the CEO to pay attention to what are the driving forces in play that might meaningfully impact how they create value to the people that they've been serving. So the overlay, for example, of even the scenario planning 2x2 that I just took us through is to say within each of those quadrants, who are the key stakeholders and what are the needs that they have in each one of those? So again, we're blending in that design orientation so that we can go back and say, okay, again, what's robust among all of them? So for this nonprofit, is there a place that they could invest in, that they could create value from what they already have expertise or what they're already able to do, perhaps delivered in a different way, but can they identify that and start experimenting with how to do that differently?
Great. I'm going to combine two questions here. I have one from Sharon Richmond and one from Calvin Mays. So it's about inclusion in vulnerable populations. It says, how do you design a process so that vulnerable populations and people in power who may have little incentive to engage folks without power can co-create a process that will get to an outcome that's good for all?
Yeah. Yes. How much time do we have? I mean, this is the opportunity, right? I mean, this is exposing this moment, the extraordinary inequity in power that people have. And as Dan said earlier, how easy it is for vulnerable populations to not even be seen or invited to participate. And I think that this is an incredibly important time to sort of take a step back and to look at our society and to say, who are the populations that are most at risk? And can we understand what the risks are in different granular ways? So let's just take, for example, education. Schools are not open. We've had to figure out how to educate in a variety of ways. Let's not make an assumption that everybody has access to a device that can get them online to get access to the learning. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that that the environments in which they're living in are all the same or conducive, or that there is the core support that they need at home in order to even be prepared to learn, that they're not being prepared. So again, it's embracing this with a mindset of openness, of desire to serve and to learn, and to really try to create a process that allows for that time of discovery. And again, I want to say from the very beginning, the most important thing is to create shared understanding of what it is that you're trying to do together. A lot of times we race to solutions. Our brain loves to get to the answer. We were rewarded early on, 2 + 2 = 4. Yes, gold star. So we like to get to the answer. It's hard for us to steep in the problem. And again, this is what I would suggest that design is really good at, is to make sure we're really understanding the problem and therefore can include others in the process of trying to solve the problem.
Cordell, if I could add one thing,
Yes.
I was just thinking, Lisa, you really got me thinking. One person who's a great design thinker and futurist is Brian Stevenson,
Yes.
who created, the whole Equal Justice Foundation, all the work that he's done with many others for people who are on death row, for people who are on the pipeline that's been constructed to take men of color to prison, especially. And to draw attention to the history of lynching and racially motivated violence. But Brian got there under the principle of proximity.
Mhm.
It was being a young person working to help one death row person, one person, offered him the relationship that then changed his thinking and led him to want still more authenticity of relationship with still more people like that first client. And all this other work he's designed has come out of that, the power of that proximity. And that was a mindset that wasn't about building all those solutions to problems, but it was about a genuine and authentic relationship first.
I love that example, Dan, because, this notion of getting proximate, is just a wonderful way of, can I get close enough so I can learn and feel what you're feeling to the extent that I can.
Yeah.
And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we spent a lot of time learning how to include empathy into our practices, not so that we can judge, but that so we can get proximate.
Yeah.
And so I think this is an interesting opportunity with so much proliferation of content on the web and people sharing stories for us to really slow down and hear those stories and maybe take a next step, right? To hear about like what's going on in your world that led to this story. And so I think this is a time for us to open up our aperture to sort of, really understand what is going out there, even at that individual level, which is so, so powerful.
Yeah, this one is for Dan, and it's from me. I want you to take transport your body back 3 years ago. Okay, so it's 2017. You're leading a university, and you're going through something similar like this. What goes through your mind as you look to plan for that next graduating class as the leader of a university when higher ed is fundamentally changing?
I think that when I was in the role of president of Franklin and Marshall College, and before that at Georgetown, always at the forefront of my mind was how to first make sure that each student was fully empowered to create the education that she seeks, and that the purpose of this education was to help them understand that they are an active learner and that they could develop mindsets for continued learning and for creativity and for agency that they would carry with them throughout their lives. And that the educational process was constructed so that they were both genuinely learning and learning that they were a learner and that they were in control of that. That was always first. And I wanted everything that we did, if possible, to reinforce that value. And then second, the institution of a university and all schools have a public good. They're not just for the private gain of the students in them, but for the society that supports them. And so second, that our work should be moving towards greater social contribution, always nonpartisan, but the spirit of serving those with whom we're in relationship with, whether it's the community that we're nestled in or those we're in relationship with far, far away who we can't see, but who our actions influence. And that's always those two things always on my mind all the time. It's quite a privilege to be part of institutions organized to let the employees think that way.
Right. Lisa, so you're in a university environment right now. So what's going through your mind?
Yeah, well, I just want to quickly comment on Dan's experience, which is, everything that you just shared. It's really those three elements encapsulated: seeing the future, right, and having clarity about what an institution of education is about for its students and its community, shaping the future, so being choiceful about how you're going to do it, and then sharing the future, a vision for what this is about, and then allowing them to share that future too, so we can have amplified value. So I love that experience. I would say, Cordell, I mean, it is such an interesting time for anyone who's in education, and particularly in higher ed, where we are seeing a lot of questions about how is higher ed and going to weather this, a lot of ambiguity about, what does the return look like, and what can institutions do to support their students and the other activities that go around it. Again, I will default to, what do we know to be true? We know that everyone involved is going to need a lot more emotional support than we ever thought imaginable.
Mhm.
We know that we're going to have to create conditions of safety, and what that means to come back and feel like you can join a community in whatever tactics that take, so if and when we get back to sports, for example, what's going to make it feel safe to go and cheer on a football team or to celebrate? What's going to feel safe to be back in a class with others? So I think going back to some of those fundamental human questions about serving learners in a way that, to Dan's point, helps them be learners their whole life,
Mhm.
helps them learn how to embrace agency. I think that's what's ahead of us. At the end of the day, I believe that higher ed and even K-12 too, we have to be thinking towards expanding the community of proactive problem solvers. Like,
Mm.
how do we do that? And I think we're going to see a wide range of the choices that presidents take in thinking about what this looks like for their institutions going forward.
Well, I think that means we absolutely have to have a university president online soon. So Dan, I'll be calling you. I want to shift to the philanthropic community. We have a question from Mary Jo Hunt, and she's saying that her philanthropic community is starting to come together around a conversation of build back better, and they're be combining adaptive thinking, system thinking, design thinking with scenario planning. So as they seek to apply this tactic, this strategy, what questions should be in the front of their mind as they seek to build that out?
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So I'm so delighted to hear that. And I think we're seeing a lot of those efforts, communities coming together and really both wanting very much to put their resources to work on behalf of a future that we are excited to be a part of, and they don't quite know where, how to do that. Because it is complicated, as Dan said earlier. The first thing I would do, and this may sound a little simple, is to map it. Like, map the ecosystem before you dive into anywhere. Make sure, going back to that notion I said earlier, build understanding. What does the system look like? What does it look like today? What has it looked like? What do you want it to look like in the future? So that you can start to identify the parts that require strengthening in whatever way that means, where you can rally those resources in order to get towards that value that you're looking for. A lot of times what I've seen is, again, we jump to sort of, oh, we could put our money here. Yeah, that would work. Let's do that. Versus to say, well, what is it that we're trying to solve for? In what way? One of my favorite tools, I was just talking about this with a colleague and friend who runs a large nonprofit down here, who has a number of business models within the nonprofit. And I think that happens when we have like a place-based nonprofit that also has a school, that also has a cultural and arts component. And they have a number of different business models, all of which relied upon this thing called being there in person in order to get it. And I think, Cordell, you're experiencing this too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the question then becomes, how can you use your key assets that you have that are not necessarily in the place itself and create value differently? And that's where the sort of questioning and the experimentation can come in. So I would say there are a lot of tools that can help you visually map it out in order to make sure that you are thinking about the right leverage points that you're investing in towards the right outcomes. And knowing that it's going to be a process. It's going to be a bunch of hypotheses over time.
Well, speaking of process, we have a attendee here from Mexico, and he works at a fintech company, 300 plus employees. They want to redesign a innovation / future sprint that brings insights on this new paradigm where everybody's working from home. So new products, new way of thinking. He's asking, how do we start? Do we invite everybody? Do we select certain people from different departments? Do you have a preferred method that you would suggest here?
I would say the most important, first of all, that's wonderful. I love, again, all this action that people are taking. The most important thing that I would encourage them to do is to really frame the question that they're after. And I would suggest, even starting off with the question of what new products and services are needed is the wrong question. The question is, what are the pain points of people that are at home? What happens when they have a good day? Can we help amplify that? What gets in their way of helping them feel like their best selves? Can we try to alleviate some of those pains? So rather than going at it from like what product and service is necessary, to go at it from what is needed of whatever demographic they're hoping to reach. And that will open up a far bigger opportunity of potential solutions that they could then design and deliver.
Great, great. So I have one I think is both to Dan and to you, Lisa, because they specifically reference something that Dan just shared earlier about higher ed. It's like, how would you recommend folks approach systematic problems that feel insurmountable and over politicized, like climate change? It's so overwhelming. There's many organizations, there's people that believe, that don't believe. You know, how do you create solutions when there's no consensus using this process?
Dan, you want to start?
I don't know. I'm thinking I should let you go first. So let me hold back for a second.
I would say, at least this is my approach. I always like to start small and build on small successes until they become bigger. And I should say that colleagues of mine are running a scaling workshop. And in fact, tomorrow night, they're having a public one with Bob Sutton and Chris Ye, who wrote a book on scaling. So I think that's a great opportunity to learn more about this. But I really like to start small, Cordell, because sometimes those big problems, climate change, they're really abstract. Like what does that mean? And it means lots of different things to lots of different people. I mean, I even alluded earlier, this fall, I undertook a really audacious goal of trying to create voter agency among young voters, right? How do we help them become better critical thinkers about the upcoming election? I'm not a civics person. I mean, I was a government major a very long time ago. But the scenario planner in me saw that none of the driving forces from 2016 were changed in any way. They were only amplified, right? More noise, more complexity, more confusion, more misinformation. And the designer in me saw no scaffolding that allowed our young folks to actually embrace a critical mindset, to go back to the core leadership requirements of, in this case, the role of the president. Like, what are the leader, not who do I like better, not who had the better soundbite, but if I'm thinking critically about what I care about and what I believe that position calls for, as stated in the job description of the Constitution, how would you do that? So that's pretty much. So what did I do? I just started to identify, okay, let's go back to the things that are known. Well, we know there's a job description. We know that there's a bunch of leadership requirements. We know that people can engage with their own point of view of taking a look at those two things and having a conversation across difference. And so all of this is to say is that you've got to break it down to these small bits. And I will say in that case, we've now run it with over 300 students, where I have students saying, wow, I used to think I wasn't qualified and now I'm ready. I used to think what my parents thought and now I think for myself. And so now we're saying, okay, how could we scale it to 20,000 students or more by the fall? But it's bit by bit. Well, breaking it down. So, we could have said, how do we tackle voter apathy? And then just be stuck, instead of saying, what's actually missing? What do we know to be true? And how do we go after one piece of it in order to affect change?
I like that approach. That's the one I've used the most, working within higher education and nonprofit institutions. And I think that it's important to understand what is the context within which you're working, so that solutions or strategies can be developed that are appropriate to the context. So in the context of higher education, I was part of an effort to help Franklin and Marshall College triple its investment in need-based financial aid and triple its enrollment of students who receive federal Pell Grants, which means they come from lower income communities or very low income communities. And then to create a larger initiative in which other schools chose to opt in and take their approach to the way we had done this approach to becoming a more richly talented organization in our student body. And so that's slow. It was addressing a systemic problem of not enough low-income students with high talent, high motivation in highly selective schools. And we did it in a way that was appropriate first to our school and then to the system of higher education where all power is distributed. I do think it's very important to remember that the political arena is an arena in which to work for change, and that some challenges require political participation and political solutions. And I think that's really important, that especially for people who really want to make systemic change, where the political arena is one of the necessary arenas, that they roll up their sleeves and get in there.
Yeah.
And if I could just quickly build on that, I mean, because we actually have a piece in one of the books I've written about the role of politics, and not just like the political arena, but the fact that politics exists in every organization. To think that it doesn't is to be Pollyanna. And I
Yeah.
think that's where we get blindsided by the antibodies that come our way, even though our idea is so good. And so to, again, use empathy as a way to understand, where is that coming from? Can you help me understand your position? How might we find common ground by leading into difference, knowing that we're going to have difference and we shouldn't expect otherwise. And that can be a really effective lever for getting some unexpected allies on your side.
That's a really good point. That was certainly what happened in the Franklin and Marshall experience of becoming a more inclusive school. We started with a conversation that was really who are we, what do we want to be, given the changes in the world. In the political arena, it's happened sometimes too. Look at the movement for marriage equity. Who would have thought that LGBT marriage would be possible 15 years ago? It was a non-starter as recently as the Bush-Kerry campaign, where it was used, where the notion of being supportive of gay marriage was used as a wedge issue, and then it changed, and that involved finding common cause, people on different political sides.
Great. Well, in our last 4 minutes, and I see there's a lot of Q&A, and I want to say this. Number one, there will be a summary that comes out of the key points from this session, and hopefully that'll answer some of your questions. And I'll forward everything else to Lisa. Lisa is also joining us this summer for our Summer Socrates virtual extravaganza, and I'll let her speak to that. But before I do, there are a lot of questions, Dan, about what should I do as a leader? We're here now. What do I do? You are leading a very large global organization through some very challenging times. I wonder if you could speak very quickly to the books you're reading, the ways you find comfort, the way you deal with all of this uncertainty, and all of the emotions of these people you lead.
Yeah. Listen, include, serve, be yourself. I myself try to be the same person every single day at home and at work. I'd like it if others thought, I know what it's like to work with Dan as a partner and a colleague, because I know who's showing up every day. And so those have the way I tend to approach it. But being intentional and thoughtful about who one is and how to be that person consistently, I think is very important.
Great. And Lisa, folks have asked about your books. And so if you could rattle off a few titles so folks know where to find on Amazon. And also if you could just speak literally for 30 to 45 seconds about what you're going to do with us on July the 10th for our summer extravaganza.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be a part of that, Cordell. So thank you for the inquiry in the books. The first book is called Moments of Impact: How to Design Strategic Conversations to Accelerate Change. That book was written a little over 5 years ago, but it's honestly more important now than ever, because we need strategic conversations that bring in a diversity of voices and those populations that don't often get included in order to discover our way forward. And the premise of that book is that, again, we were never really taught how to do this most critical leadership skill. That meetings are not about finishing on time or getting to an answer. It's really about discovery and learning and co-creating. So that's the book. And then a complementary book is called Design a Better Business, which has about 20 different tools to actually help people through the design process. And so there's a lot in there, like a design criteria, like a cover story. And perhaps that's a first step that leaders can take too, is to say, a year from now, what's the story I want to tell about my organization, and who's involved, and how do I think about different stakeholders, both our employees and our customers and the partners that we work with, and then start taking that first step. So there's lots of very practical tools in that, and all the tools are online, so they can even take a look, Design a Better Business online. And I'll just say the last 10 seconds, I'm so excited to be a part of the Socrates seminar as a learner. It was one of the highlights of my year last year, and it actually inspired what I'm going to be doing with you in July. So this is called Vote by Design, and it does take a critical thinking approach at thinking about the leadership skills required for the job of the presidency. So if you can imagine that Daniel Kahneman, like thinking slow and testing assumptions, meets Doris Kearns Goodwin around thinking critically about the leadership qualities in an immersive experience, there it is.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. This was riveting. I really enjoyed this today. And to our listeners, please know this will be available within 48 hours on YouTube and the Aspen Socrates website. And we'll be back next Thursday with a discussion with Vivian Schiller and Andres Wagon on big data. Thank you all so much. Have an amazing week. Bye.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Cordell.
Bye, Dan.
Thank you, Dan and Lisa. Thank you all so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.